Let's make a start. I'm Tom Misham. I'm here to introduce today's webinar. I'd like to commence with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians on all the lands on which we live and work and pay our respects to elders both past and present. And for me, that's the Yagara and Turrbal people. I extend respect to all our traditional owners across all the lands where we work. So I'd like to introduce Fitsum Weldegiorgis. Fitsum is an economist and social scientist currently working at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. He's previously worked for GHD and also at the International Institute for Economic Development in London. Fitsum has worked all around the world, and in particular in Australia, Botswana, Chile, Eritrea, India, United States, Solomon Islands, and many other places as well. So it's a great pleasure to be introducing Fitsum. We'll just bring up your title, Fitsum, which is focused on energy transition through economic transformation. As always, we're going to hear from Fitsum, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Please post your questions and comments in the chat, and I will moderate those. Just a reminder that we are recording today, and you should be able to see this recording on the website in a little while after today. Okay, so over to you, Fitsum.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's an honor to be presenting in this webinar. Just by way of a background, when I started, not started, but my latest research on coal mining was in 2022 when the CRC time provided me with a PhD top-up funding to conduct a research in the Central Highlands, Queensland. And I followed that up with similar research in the US and Canada. Basically, I think the motivation for me is really the fact that much of the growing body of the energy transition related literature has more or less focused on the environmental impacts and technology solutions for developing clean energy. However, of paramount importance is really understanding how abandoning fossil fuel may detrimentally affect industries and economic well-being of the communities that have relied on these resources for generations, such as those in Central Highlands, Queensland. So with that, being the core driver of my research, I then basically had a couple of questions that guided my research. One is really to understand how the phase out of coal mining could impact regional economies. And then the other one is whether and what strategies can be put in place to diversify economies in clean energy industries, as well as other economic sectors. I did two separate research activities. So the first one was focused on Central Highlands, Queensland, guided by the same questions. And then I followed that up last year with the same research in the states of southeastern or Montana, but mainly focusing on southeastern Montana, eastern Pennsylvania, as well as southeastern British Columbia in Canada. In terms of methodology, in addition to using semi-structured interviews, I also used a method called Q methodology. Q methodology is basically a method that allows you to kind of collect data, qualitative data, on the perspectives of multi-stakeholder groups. And then it also helps you analyze that qualitative data quantitatively in order to generate shared perspectives. Today I will be presenting on the findings of the research in those three regions of Montana, Pennsylvania, and British Columbia. So with Q methodology, the first thing that I did, or that everyone has to do, is really to have a concourse of topics. So in this case, I looked at the historical context and state of play, socioeconomic structures, institutional settings, governance arrangement, potential environmental and economic impacts, technology alternatives, and potential strategy and roles of various stakeholders. Based on this concourse, then I put together large number of statements, and then I landed to 46 statements, which we call them Q samples. So I ran those samples with in total 60 participants from across these three regions. And these participants were deliberately selected to ensure that they are well informed of the topic from the perspectives and interests of various stakeholders, including government organizations, environmental groups, mining and energy companies, scholars, practitioners, policy advisors, community groups, development organizations, business organizations as well. So after an analysis, which is called factor analysis, I came up with a result of two factors, which, in other words, we call them two shared perspectives. And factor one is mainly around climate action first. So those people who loaded significantly in factor one believed in climate action first, and those who loaded significantly in factor two were of the view that coal as a commodity needs to be utilized before we even transition. And these are the different criteria that had to be satisfied for me to select two factors. I won't go into detail on those criteria, but straight into the results. So this slide shows, the results in terms of where or how the different stakeholder groups position themselves across these two factors or shared perspectives. So as you can see, around 92% of environmental groups and 67% of, the scholars and practitioners loaded significantly in factor one, which means that they are of the view that climate action should come first, whereas 89% of mining and energy companies, as well as all of the business organizations, loaded in factor two, which may not be a surprise that they are of the view that there is still demand for coal and it has to be utilized while we transition to clean energy. But also the other groups, such as government organizations, community groups, and development organizations were divided across these two perspectives, which shows that there is some hesitance to the issue of coal phase out. So in this slide, I show, the results of, how the not only stakeholders, but also by regions, how they position themselves across the two factors. So one of the interesting findings here is that in the case of Pennsylvania, government participants that kind of represent governments have significantly loaded in factor two, which means that they are of the view that there is still time to utilize coal before we transition. I think it's telling simply because, or if we consider that Pennsylvania is relatively past coal mining, they have transitioned out of coal, albeit they have transitioned into the use of gas. But it contrasts with the findings in those other regions of Montana and British Columbia, where governments were divided. They were divided between the two factors. So some of the government participants were of the view of climate action first. Others were, really hopeful of using coal mining in the near future. In this slide, the first two diagrams are just showing the contrasting aspects of those two factors. They are quite opposing statements. I will come into those statements in a bit, but those numbers are showing the statements or the significant statements that the participants have strong views on across these two factors. And the last diagram is just showing the statements on which all the participants have consensus with. So they agreed on all those statements. So if we look at factor one, or the shared perspective around, or that prioritizes the climate action first, the diagram shows two different sorts of statements or groups of statements. The green ones are those statements that the participants who loaded significantly in this factor one agreed with, whereas the red ones are those statements that they disagreed with. So just to go on some of them, so these participants were of the view that adverse economic cost of climate change is far worse than the cost of transitioning from coal. And they also agree that there has to be a dedicated fund to boost economic diversification. And also, of course, they strongly push for developing cleaner technology in order to mitigate climate impact. Of course, also they advocate for skills programs. But also, to be fair on them, I think they support, or they are of the view that the transition will involve an energy mix of gas and renewables for decades, for the next 3 or 4 decades. But I think they are quite, strong, or they note that relying on fossil fuels could be detrimental. And so the transition has to come as fast as possible. And on the other hand, they disagree with the view that their respective countries should take the lead on climate change. So they are of the view that the United States and Canada should indeed take the lead in terms of action on climate. And so, yeah, they prioritize the transition from coal, and that it is an irrelevant rather than irrelevant concept or action. And also, yeah, statements like, I can't think of any alternative economic source to replace coal in my region. This is the statement that they disagree with, and so on and so forth. And when we look at the factor two, or the statements that were strongly agreed with or disagreed with by those who loaded significantly in factor two, you can see that the main concern is really around job losses, and economic decline as a result of phasing out from coal. So they believe that the use of fossil fuel-based technologies is necessary to meet energy demands, even as we transition. Some of the comments were that, we could still utilize coal in the transition, only in terms of developing cleaner energy, but also in terms of utilizing coal before it phases out, because there is still demand for coal. And so I think the majority are really concerned about the impact of a rapid transition from coal on regional economies. So they can't think of any alternative economic sources to replace coal in those regions, at least. And some are also agreeable to technologies such as CCUS, carbon capture and use and storage, as well as hydrogen-based economy. They, of course, on the other hand, disagree on the comment about employment being, the impact on employment being insignificant. They feel that fossil fuel-based technologies are not a waste of resources, and coal phase out should not be necessary because of climate change only, but also we need to think about economic impact and the impact on the communities that have relied on them for years. Here is an attempt really to kind of posit the highlight comments by the participants across a timeline of the coal transition. So on the left-hand side, you can see that not only are comments such as, coal has a place in our economy, coal transition kills economy, are comments in the past, but also there are some people, and they are not just also comments from a developing country perspective, but also, coal regions like in Montana and British Columbia have some participants at least have those views. And so, one of the comments is that, we can't go cold turkey on coal. Transition is politically motivated. Show us the alternative. What's the alternative? Unless you do that, we can't transition because our economy depends on it. What about jobs and so on? But I think I would say, in general, people are or concede that the world will eventually transition sooner or later out of coal. But I think the problem or the disagreement lies in how and when to transition. So the speed of transition and what that transition would involve. And that's what is reflected in these comments on the right hand. There are many who believe that there has to be some sort of activity in terms of providing dedicated funds to boost economic diversification. And many people actually commented that it doesn't have to be just transition of energy, but also a transition of economies, which I will talk about more in a bit. So just key takeaways from this study. Understanding multi-stakeholder perspectives is really crucial in terms of coming up with approaches such as social justice, community resilience, economic diversification, environmental justice. You need that kind of perspectives to underpin those approaches. And methods such as Q methodology in the interviews are really helpful in terms of unpacking those perspectives. As I said earlier, the perceptions of coal transitions differ by region, coal type. So there is so much, so many comments that urge for distinction between thermal and metallurgical coal, for example, and also the type of technological innovation and the social acceptance, political lenience, occupational types that need to be pursued, and so on. So overall, there is a general realization, as I said earlier, that it's a matter of time before coal phases out, but the point of serious contention is really how to phase out. So it will take the development of a diversified energy, but also a diversified economic systems to transition from coal successfully. So where does that lead us? Well, do we need a rethinking of the just transition concept? Rather than looking at the energy transition as merely a structural change in such a way that we are just transitioning from one form of energy to its cleaner form, or we need to broaden our conceptualization. Really, I think it boils also down to how we define the what we call clean energy. So interrogating that definition really helps the discussion around the nature and scope of the transition process. We know that there are efforts around different forms of justices. So we hear a lot around about restorative justice, distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition, and so on. But I think economic dimension of that energy justice is either buried in the social justice, or it has really focused on the role of energy production and consumption on economic growth and community building, community well-being. Yes, understanding economics around energy transition and general socio-economic impacts is crucial, but I think this is more or less an impact-driven approach, which lacks forward sight. So I think it will require extending the energy transition and justice framework such that we broaden the conceptualization of transition beyond energy-only transition, but also beyond the focus on traditional economic objectives such as employment, industry competitiveness, and innovation as merely being core benefits. So I suppose, or I propose, that an economic diversification approach to energy justice is or could provide a pathway to an integrated justice framework. It could be a linchpin for energy transition policy and initiatives to target regulations, funds, and other resources in leveraging existing assets and developing infrastructure and technology in order to build existing and new economic industries. So I think, as one of my participants commented, that the term transition perhaps is problematic, especially for those communities in Montana or even in Central Highlands, Queensland. Instead, I think people are comfortable with terms such as transformation or diversification, which could really encapsulate this broader conceptualization of what that transition should look like. So it's about that transition, exploring that the broader conceptualization of transition is really about exploring diversity in economic activities, which could not only address the socio-economic impact of energy transition, but also determine the type and scale of the clean energy technologies that could be developed. So it would involve treating energy as a crucial input in the development of diversified industries, but also making transformation of economies beyond that of energy as a center piece that involves utilizing existing and newly developed assets and resources and technologies for economic diversification. So that approach could really not only address the economic well-being of communities, but also it addresses or promotes sustainable environmental and social outcomes. And finally, so framing the transition, the energy transition analysis using both the economic and environmental parameters in equal measures could ensure that innovative energy technology investments are guided by industrial objectives. And so we are able to formulate progressive policies such as the so-called green industrial policy, which incorporates clean industrial development. Yes, developing diversified economies often are conceived as an abstract theories, but I think with the right policy and strategy, the implementation of those policies could simply be or involve, the development or promotion of small and medium-sized enterprises and startups. An example is the Just Transition Fund in the US, which promotes economic diversification through providing grants for entrepreneurs and innovation activities. But to advancing this approach would really require public and private sector coordination and an extensive quantitative and qualitative research and strategic regional assessment. Uh, um, so I would like to conclude by acknowledging the support that was provided to me by the CRC team. I also thank Professor Kathleen Arajo and Cassie Corner from the Energy Policy Institutes in Idaho for providing the list of participants as well as helping with communication as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Fitsum. Excellent presentation. We have a couple of questions already, so I'm just going to read them out in order. So the first one is, great presentation, thanks. Did I understand correctly that data was just from Montana, Pennsylvania, and British Columbia? If so, can you talk a little on the applicability of your analysis and recommendations?
Applicability of the analysis? Sorry,
of analysis and recommendations to countries and contexts outside those jurisdictions. So first of all, maybe the first part of the question is where the data were collected. So was it restricted to Montana, Pennsylvania, British Columbia?
Yes, it was restricted. So those participants, 60 participants were from those three regions, as I indicated in one of my diagrams.
Yeah.
So it's basically focused on those regions. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, although the analysis, covers those states in general as a whole, but I think they are specifically focused on southeastern Montana, southeastern British Columbia, and eastern Pennsylvania.
So then I guess the second part of the question is on how you sort of see the applicability of that analysis on those recommendations to other locations.
Yeah, I think if I were, for example, to speak about how these findings position themselves with respect to the Australian context or the Central Highlands context, there are some similarities, although there are also some differences. So, for example, in the Australian context, I didn't think that I would present it here, but I think in the Australian analysis, I had three factors as opposed to two factors here. But two of those three factors are similar to these two factors that we have here, or two shared perspectives. So you can imagine that there are opinions around coal phase out are similar across these different countries, but also there are some nuances around the differences between. But I think in terms of applying the recommendations, I think that you could take that on board, not literally, but I think overall they could be applicable to other regions that have been dependent on coal. Maybe not at national level per se, but I think when you look at regions that have depended heavily on coal mining, I think these are some of the common perspectives, and the recommendation thereof could be applicable to those other regions.
So if I've understood correctly, the work that you're presenting here is focused on those locations in North America, but you have done other work in Australia which has similarities. You mentioned there are some differences. Maybe can you just sort of highlight a couple of the key differences?
Yeah. So maybe to start off with the commonalities, I think people are of the view that we can't phase out, as soon as generally expected. So there has to be some lead time before we phase out coal. So At the same time, there are some views that coal can be utilized in the transition process. But that view differs across regions. For example, in the case of Australia, there's not much emphasis on or understanding per se in terms of technologies such as CCUS, for example, or the use of coal in hydrogen generation, for example, which is different to places such as in British Columbia, for example. There's strong view that especially metallurgical coal is here to stay for many decades to come. So these are some of the differences that I can point out to. But also in terms of the economic context of these regions, kind of informs the comments from these different regions. So if you look at Montana, for example, it is especially southeastern Montana. They are basically dependent on energy for the economy. So coal-based energy at the moment. And so the transition or the transformation that they would want to happen is that it has to be based on energy-based diversification. Whereas in Pennsylvania, for example, people are open to other economic industries other than energy. I would say similar in Central Highlands, Queensland, where people think that some towns could die out because they have no other economic activities that they could develop, and so it's practically impossible given the context and the resources that are there to kind of develop a new industry there. So these are some of the differences that I could mention.
Thanks, Fitsum. We'll move on to the next question. So this is about renewables. Did you see any application of renewables being deployed into rehabilitated mine lands in those jurisdictions? And if so, was that green energy directed to new economic activity or simply fed into the grid?
Sorry, I missed the first part.
So the question is, did you see any application of renewables being developed in the rehabilitated mine lands or the former mine locations? Did you see renewable energy?
Yes. So if we are going to speak about the North American context, in some cases, there are some renewable energy, such as solar. And in Montana, for example, southeastern Montana, they have already started wind farms, which they hope to increase the scale in order, in anticipation that the energy generated could join up the existing power line. So this and there is a talk of utilizing all mine areas for developing further wind farms and solar farms as well. Similarly, in Central Highlands, Queensland, for example, solar farms are being developed, which the perspective of communities or stakeholders differ, in terms of their whether they are suitable for the land in terms of aesthetic, for example, as well as in terms of how the scale of solar farms versus the power that could be generated out of them and the use of the land. So yes, there are examples of post-mine lands being used in these types of renewable energy technologies. Also, hydrogen is another example, but I haven't seen or heard that those are being developed in post-mine lands. But I think certainly there are hydrogen hubs, different hydrogen hubs being promoted across the US, including in Pennsylvania, and West Virginia as well.
This is a sort of side question to what you just discussed there. In those contexts where you did see renewables coming in, and it sounds like it was a lot of that was to do with focusing on substituting the energy. Was there also a discussion around the comparison of the employment circumstances? You know, the sort of the pay rates or the kind of the nature of the work and so on and so forth. This is something that comes up quite often when we talk about the decline or the reduction in coal and the increase in renewables. Did this come up in those situations?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. I think those who loaded, for example, in terms of the analysis, loaded in the first factor, the second factor, which kind of is pro coal mining, at least in the short term, they are skeptical about, renewable energy or cleaner energy providing the same the same scale and proportion of employment as coal mining. So there is hesitancy in that respect. But in terms of pay, I haven't heard much around that. I think perhaps many people do not have that much information about the pay with employment with in renewable energy industry versus coal mining. But the perspective on pay comes with respect to coal mining and other economic activities. So there's a general consensus that coal mining pays exponentially higher than other economic activities such as farming or tourism. In fact, there were strong comments that tourism and farming wouldn't cut it in terms of industries that could be focused on in the transition, simply because, for example, tourism is said to be very seasonal and it doesn't employ a lot, whereas farming depends on the area. For example, in Montana, people claim that this is not an area for farming that much. So yes, there's so much talk about what kind of employment can be promoted as we transition away from coal. And that's why there is kind of a consensus across all the participants that skills training and programs really to train coal workers as well as other regional communities should be based on the industries that could be developed as part of the diversification activities, economic diversification activities.
Something of a segue there fits them into the next question, which is actually around the nature of diversification, and that actually diversification by itself is not necessarily sufficient for economic development, and that there's a strong focus in some places, and in particular Europe, of what we call smart specialization. So I guess the question here is, do you have any thoughts on the dispositions, or to look at the dispositions towards that smart specialization type of thinking, as opposed to what you might call straightforward diversification? And also any attitudes with regards to particular specialization industries or specialization alternatives for different groups?
Yeah, I think I think the general opinion is that we can't really focus on specialized kind of job options. And that's why I think people are concerned that we would be running around a circle. We have been specializing on coal jobs, and now with coal phase out, then there might not be a position for these coal miners. So unless you kind of retrain them into other mining activities or other economic activities. But I think before you do that, I think that an interesting comment is that you really need to think about, before you kind of focus on specialized, job positions or alternatives, it's best to kind of work around the type of industries that you could attract in the areas. So an example is in Pennsylvania, where the Chamber of Commerce have been working for years to kind of attract, um, suitable industries that could fit and utilize the existing resources in that region. And as they develop those industries, or as they introduce those industries in the area, they believe that the jobs that fit to those industries could be developed concurrently. Otherwise, I think even in Central Highlands, Queensland, people are of the view that we shouldn't rush into kind of focusing on specialized training activities for specialized jobs, unless those jobs are reflecting the future industries that could be attracted into those areas.
Thanks, Fitz. So it makes me think also about a move in the US in the Appalachian region, or the Ohio River Basin, Ohio River Valley, to develop Intel computer chip manufacturing there. So it's kind of a significant state investment, or government investment in that kind of industry. It's not, I'm not sure if it counts as a smart specialization or not, but it's certainly an example of thinking about different types of development. My feeling is that it won't be in the kind of the real midst of the actual close to the coal mines themselves. It'll be in the sort of the broader sort of state, but that's something to look into as well, I guess. We have another question here. Actually, it's a follow-up to your original response to the first question I asked about the applicability of comparing between locations. And the question is, have you looked at, or could you talk about, jurisdictions where there is a considerable state participation in coal mining? So sort of state-owned companies, state-owned operations, that kind of thing. Have you considered this, or is it something that you are factoring into your analysis, or do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
State participation as in government state government, or state-based companies?
I think that the focus of the question is where you have government owned mining companies, so government owned mining. I think that's what, or not necessarily mining, but also the electricity generation as well. But, yeah.
Okay, no, that's a good question. Actually, that is also another difference between different regions. So in the case of Central Highlands, in general, the general view is that there is, in fact, I will start with the commonalities between these four regions, in North America and Central Highlands, is that, there is discrepancy or also inconsistent kind of policy initiatives coming out of state and federal governments. This is common in North America as well as here. But in terms of active role of states with initiatives, I think it's more pronounced in North America than here in Central Highlands. For example, in Central Highlands, one of the comments is that we are in limbo. We don't know what to do unless because the federal government doesn't have a strong position one way or the another, or a clear policy direction for us to follow. Whereas in the North American context, especially in the US, what you find is that there is, especially when you talk about the funds that are coming out of the federal government, especially using the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there's a strong signal that the government is promoting clean energy technologies across different states, and so as a result of that, then states are benefiting and utilizing those funds to kind of design their own strategies around how they would like to transition away from coal. But still, there is some issues. Even there's some disagreements, as I said earlier, especially when you look at Montana, for example. There's strong disagreements between the states and the federal government in terms of the direction towards clean energy. So, as I said earlier, the state government is of the view that there is still time for us to utilize coal mining, and unless there is an alternative to kind of support local economies, it's impossible and not advisable to rush into utilizing those initiatives by the federal government to transition to cleaner energy. Yeah, so yes, just a long answer, but the short answer is that yes, there are initiatives, especially in the North American context, by the states. But I think mostly it's driven by the federal kind of policies and initiatives around the transition.
Certainly, they have some very interesting policies and initiatives in the US, and you mentioned some of them there. Do you have the feeling that there is confidence when they are administering those policies as to how to direct the resources that they have? So I'm just thinking back to some of the comments that emerged through the material that you presented, and also thinking about some of these questions in the chat. How do you think about the level of confidence as to how to utilize those resources and kind of apply those policies? And coming back to your focus on diversification and some of those questions around specialization, do you think there is a reasonable sense of what to diversify into across these different locations?
Yeah, I think when you said that, Tom, I kind of remember some of the strong comments we had in the last, global coal conference that you and I were in Columbus recently, and that is, people, although they appreciate some, not all, but some regional communities, although they appreciate the huge funding that is available for transitioning out of coal. I think that there are two issues. One is in terms of what to utilize those funds for, and the other one is what happens in terms of the change that could happen in terms of policy following this year's election. People kind of have confidence in terms of, there is funding. Even through my research, I think many people agree that there is enough funding, but then there is also, on the other hand, disagreement, or maybe not disagreement, but uncertainty around how to use that funding. So from those comments in that conference, I think most people are okay with utilizing the funding for innovative activities and promoting entrepreneurship in more clean economic activities. But I think there is uncertainty or less confidence in terms of how far or how long this funding could stay or sustain regional economies. So, but I think I appreciate the fact that there is enough initiative in the US versus, I think there is relatively less initiative in the case of Canada as well as here in Australia. although in Australia is a little bit better than in Canada. But when I say Canada, I think it differs, of course, by regions. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's kind of the answer I have for that question.
Thanks, Fitsum. Well, look, there aren't any more questions coming through in the chat. So what we might do is wrap it up there. I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation, and like to thank all the people who've been asking comments and questions in the chat. It's been really enriching the discussion. So thanks so much. And we will leave it there. This presentation will be available on the CRC Time website in a little while. So thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Fitsum.
Thank you.